Hello and welcome to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion here at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. We are really pleased to have you for today's CLGS Jewish Queeries Series event featuring Professor Justin Jaron Lewis speaking on Assigned Female by Satan, the Genders of Eydl of Brody. Before we begin, and a hearty welcome to Professor, and before Rabbi Jane Littman has a more formal introduction of our event today, I have just a few housekeeping details, if I might. This event is being live streamed on Facebook, and it is being recorded for later viewing. We've turned off the chat feature today at the request of our speaker, and we will have time, of course, at the end for Q&A and discussion. But without any further ado, I will turn over the screen to Rabbi Jane Littman.
Hi, everyone. I know many of you and not others. I'm really glad to welcome you here. I'd like to also ask if you have a background in which it's blurred, please do not use a blurred background because that is hard from certain kinds of neurological issues people have. I first came across Justin when I was doing some reading about Hannah Rachel Vermacher, who is a well-known and perhaps imaginary Hasidic woman Rebbe, and how Hannah Rachel's existence creates challenges for scholars today about just what box to put them in and what kind of pronouns to use. And as I was doing that, I came across Justin's amazing and extraordinary scholarship on Eydl of Brody, who is even more interesting. And I said, oh, who is this guy? I got to meet him. Who are they? And I think I just called up Justin and I said, well, you're the most interesting person I've discovered in just sort of reading about stuff in a while. And I, ever since then have been, and that was probably almost 2 years ago, I think, pushing Justin to give a presentation in our query series because I sensed deeply that Justin was in resonance with queer values, whatever identity they had. And it took me this long to get Justin to agree to come. So I'm so thrilled and happy because this is really a treat. Last query series, our scholar affiliate Jay Michelson said that this was the best title he'd ever heard in a presentation. And it's a good title because it is a super interesting subject about how we look at the past and how we organize our thoughts about people who were in a certain way queer or unusual in their own circumstances and how we understand it. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Justin and give us all the treat of listening to their wisdom on this.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you, Bernie, for these lovely introductions. I'm so honored to be part of this series and excited to be here with the people I see and with whoever may be watching this on Facebook or later. I mainly just want to talk, but I'm going to share a couple of slides to begin with. So let me get that worked out. As usual, it takes me a moment. So first of all, just to acknowledge that this is Yom HaShoah, one of the days set apart for remembering the victims and honoring the survivors of the Holocaust. And I think it's very appropriate to be speaking about what came before, a glimpse of the very rich and diverse Jewish civilization, really, of Eastern Europe. And that included the Hasidic movement, a spiritual and social movement of prayer and joy and community. And as Jane mentioned, in the Hasidic Jewish world, The most honored, respected member of each community is the Rebbe. The Rebbe of a Hasidic group is their holy man, spiritual leader over all of the community, miracle worker, mystic, and generally male, almost assumed to be male. And when a Rebbe dies, usually his place will be taken for that community by a son or son-in-law, and the dynasty will continue. However, there have been a number of Hasidic Jewish women who took on this role of Rebbe, crossing over the usual gender roles. And as Jane mentioned, the most famous is Hannah Rachel Vermacher, the Maiden of Ludmir. I highly recommend this book by Nathaniel Deutsch about her, drawing on all the available evidence. The Maiden of Ludmir was controversial, especially because she was neither the daughter nor the wife or widow of a male Rebbe. Usually, that is how a woman gets to rise to that kind of position, in the reflected glow, as it were, of her father or husband. And that, in fact, is the case for Eydl or Eydle, which is a more affectionate diminutive of Brody. She was the daughter of a great and famous Rebbe, Shalom of Belz, and the wife of a lesser-known Rebbe, Isaac Rubin. And she did take on the role of Rebbe in her own right. Besides this moving between or cross-gender roles, some of the stories about Eydl of Brody strongly raise the question of gender identity. And of course, that's kind of the focus of a lot of my thinking about her. How did she see herself? And as Jane said, how can we see her now across the many decades, over a century, that have passed since then? Eydl of Brody was not only a daughter and wife of a Rebbe, she was part of a whole network of Rebbish family connections. Her mother, Malka of Belz, was a famous holy woman whom stories are told about, although she never was called Rebbe. One of Eydl's brothers, Joshua, became the second Rebbe of Belz after their father's passing. As I said, Eydl was married to a Rebbe. She has 3 daughters who married Rebbes or rabbis, and 3 sons who became Rebbes, as well as children who died in childhood. She was the macheteiniste, sort of meaning in-law, of her brother, because a son of hers married a daughter of hers, and Rebbetzin Miriam Chaya of Schotz, among others. Miriam Chaya of Schotz is one of the other Hasidic women who took on the role of Rebbe. So that's an interesting connection there. And Eydl, known as the Baba Eydle, Grandma Eydle, is the ancestor of many Hasidic families today, some of whose stories I will tell you. This is where we're looking at geographically. Belz, where she grew up, and Brody, where she lived and served as a Rebbe, are in the far west of Ukraine today, and may there be peace there. On what's today the Polish border. The borders, of course, have moved around. This is really the heartland of Hasidic Judaism in many ways. There are a number of primary sources that I've listed here. These are essentially all the sources that I have found so far in my research, and I want to quote to you from most of them. Basically, I want to read to you from the primary sources about Eydl, say a little bit about my thinking about what they say, and then really open things up for discussion, because I want to hear your insights as well as perhaps your questions. And this is Eydl's tombstone in the old Jewish cemetery in Brody. And I will be reading to you from some of what it says. So the oldest source that I want to share with you is from 1866. It is a letter from Eydl herself, preserved by descendants. I think you will find, as I do, that the whole issue of gender diversity does not really raise its head in this letter, which is almost stereotypically maternal. It is a letter from Eydl written in a mix of religious Hebrew and her everyday Yiddish to her daughter, Dina, congratulating her on the birth of her first child, Malka, apparently named for Eydl's mother. So she says as follows: with the help of God, the fourth day of the week of the Torah portion Tetzaveh, 5626, in our language, that's February 21st, 1866, here in Brody. Mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. Peace and everything good to my beloved, cherished, treasured daughter, the worthy, modest, intelligent, very dear Madam Dina. May she live for many long and good days and years. With greetings to her husband, my dear son-in-law, distinguished in Torah and piety, of holy ancestry, honored, etc. Our teacher and Rabbi, Meir, long may he live. Even for a very young man, as Meir was, in a rabbinic family, you would pile on the honorifics to the point where the letter actually says, etc., rather than saying all of them. We wish you Mazel Tov. May Hashem Yisborach, the blessed God, help everyone, so that for all of you and for all of us, there may be Mazel Tov, good fortune. May we all merit to raise the precious daughter, dear Malka, with many more good, pious children to Torah and the wedding canopy and good deeds. I very much want Hashem Yisborach, the blessed God, to help, so that you, daughter, will be able to breastfeed her yourself in good health easily. We are very surprised that you didn't send us a telegram. Praise be Hashem Yisborach for his great kindness. May he always do ever more undeserved kindness with us. May you all be healthy and strong. From your mother, who looks forward to always hearing good news from one another and to seeing you with much joy, Eydl, daughter of the holy Rebbe, the righteous man of blessed memory for the life of the world to come, may his merit shield us. So that's her deceased father, Rebbe Shalom. And she mentions now some of her children, from Elimelech, long may he live, Malka, long may she live. But the Eydl's daughter, Malka, apparently died young. We don't hear about her later. And Hannah Rachel, long may she live. With his honor, the Rabbi, her husband, we bless you with a blessing of good fortune. Mazel Tov. Greetings to my beloved Machateniste. So to the mother of the husband of my daughter, right, my Machateniste, the worthy, modest Rebbitzin, the righteous woman of holy ancestry, may God be our help. Madam Miriam Chaya, long may she live. So now speaking to Miriam Chaya, we wish you Mazel Tov, and we request of you to continue to befriend our good, very dear child and care for her. May your ancestral merit and ours stand by us forever. I greet your children, long may they live, and we wish them Mazel Tov. From your Machateniste, who wishes you everything good and much joy from all the children, long may they live. Eydl, daughter of the Holy Rebbe, the righteous man of blessed memory for the life of the world to come, may his merit shield us. So we see here Eydl as, this warm and affectionate and somewhat passive-aggressive Jewish mother. And there's really nothing remarkable about this letter. It is noteworthy that this is the only correspondence I know of between her and another woman Rebbe, Miriam Chaya, her Machateniste. And if only, they had talked about less personal things in this letter, we might have some sense of their spiritual lives and connections. And it's also interesting that she seems to be blessing the granddaughter to grow up l'toira u'lechuppah u'lemaisim toivim, to the Torah and the chuppah and a life of good deeds, mentioning the Torah in that context was traditionally just for boys, girls not being expected to become Torah scholars. So maybe she's pushing the gender roles a bit there. Anyway, I treasure hearing her voice. The next primary source I want to share is from Eydl's tombstone, which is mostly praises of her father, but it seems from her own writing that she might have liked it that way, that her father was very dear and important to her. Anyhow, about her specifically, it says as follows: the Rebbetzin, Madame Eydl, daughter of the Holy Rebbe, our teacher, Rebbe Shalom Avels, of blessed memory, passed away on Sunday, 14th Kislev, 5644, that is November 22nd, 1885. Here rests the Rebbetzin and Tzaddikus, holy woman, famous all over the world for her righteousness and for her kindness with people. Madame Eydl, her soul is in Eden, daughter of his honored holiness, Rebbe Shalom Avels. She was important and dear to her father. He took pride in her very, very much and said great things about her. Diber aleha gedolot. You could also translate, he made extravagant claims about her. May her soul be bound up in the bond of life. So consistently with other things we've got, this emphasizes that she was well known as a holy woman and that her father, the great Rebbe, thought very, very highly of her. Okay. So now we go to our next source, which is from 1910 in a book of stories about Rebbe Shalom, a letter to the author from Rabbi Abraham Itinga, who came from Brody. And he says as follows: the second daughter of the Holy Rebbe, our master, Rebbe Shalom Avels, was the famous Rebbetzin and holy woman, Madame Eydl of blessed memory of Brody. She conducted herself as a Rebbe, and people gave her kvitlach. Kvitlach are the notes that you bring to a Rebbe asking for their blessing. If you want to know if somebody is a Rebbe, offer them a kvittel. If they accept it, they are telling you that they are a Rebbe. So this is a very significant thing, that Eydl was not just like called a Rebbe, but took kvitlach. I heard that her father said about her, "Mein Eydl felt nor despotic." My Eydl is missing only the spodek, which is a fur hat worn by Hasidic men. So at this point, gender classification, let's say, raises its head. What he's saying is, wow, that daughter of mine, she's almost a man, right? If she would just put on a spodek, she'd be a man. She'd be, a Rebbe like other Rebbes. Rabbi Itinga goes on, I also heard that a man from Brody was sick with a disease of the lungs and the chest, and the doctors despaired of his life. Once the blood was flowing from his throat, and the doctors said that this blood was the last remaining piece of his lungs, and the moments of his life were numbered. His family rushed tumultuously to Eydl and told her the words of the doctors. She answered, "Behold, with my Holy Father, the memory of a holy man for a blessing, something like this happened. And my Holy Father said, first of all, I don't believe the doctors who say that this patient has no lungs left. And even if he has no lungs left, who says that we need lungs to live? The one who said that we can live with lungs will say that he can live without lungs." And that man was healed and lived for many years after that. And I hope to Hashem Yisborach that this person too will return to health. And so it was, for that person in Brody was healed and lived for many years after this incident. So we see Eydl as somebody that people turn to in the direst moments because of her power. And we see her linking her power with her late father and kind of drawing down his power into her own. So now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit chronologically, because before telling you about some stuff written in the 1930s that really zeroes in on the gender question, I want to tell you stories from Eydl's family that were told to me in 2009, though presumably, of course, they go all the way back. So I heard these from Moshe Yosef Rubin, a rabbi in Borough Park, Brooklyn, who heard them from his father and uncle. These are family traditions about die Baba Eydl, grandmother Eydl. She ran her father's household. When Eydl's son, Elimelech, who was blind, was a little boy, Rebbe Shalom asked Elimelech's Melamed, his tutor, to make him the letters of the Hebrew alphabet out of wax, so that he could learn the shapes of the letters by touching them. And Eydl burst into tears, because until that moment, she was hoping that her Holy Father would heal her son's blindness. Her father, Rebbe Shalom, answered, "Svetim gor nit shaten," it won't do him any harm, meaning that Elimelech would be great in spite of his blindness. And in fact, Elimelech became a Rebbe in his own right. In those days, in Rebbe Shalom's time, only sons inherited money and property. But there was an exception for Eydl. She inherited equally with all her brothers, unlike her older sister, Freda. And some of the things she inherited were her mother's Shabbos candlesticks, her father's clock, which was very precious for some reason, and the table where he would sit when he received kvitlach, the requests for blessings. And in general, it seems the most coveted items of her parents' household went to Eydl. When her brother, Rebbe Joshua, took over as the next Belzer Rebbe, Eydl would get annoyed whenever he changed any of their father's customs. However, according to family tradition, relations between Eydl and Joshua and their families were excellent and remain so among their descendants to this day. The Reuben family tradition is that Eydl only began acting as a Rebbe after the death of her husband in 1874. So that would be consistent with other women Rebbes who kind of took over the role of their late husbands. the Baba Eydl was a very holy woman. It's notable that men would be lined up at her door asking for blessings. Notable because many Hasidic holy women give their blessings only to other women. Once, when Eydl was ill, she was visiting with Rebbe Chaim of Tzanz, a great and famous Rebbe, and she stayed in his court over Sukkot. In Tzanz, women did not sit in the sukkah, and they did not wave the lulav, the palm branch. However, for Eydl, Rebbe Chaim gave instructions to have a one-person sukkah built for her, next to his own, with a window open into his sukkah. When Rabbi Moshe Yosef first told me this story, he added, and they talked to each other the whole time. But then later he said he couldn't verify that part of the story. In any case, they were next to each other, and Rebbe Chaim of Tzanz would have his lulav brought to Eydl for her to shake. So those are the family stories that I heard. And besides the stories, they have physical mementos of the Baba Eydl, including her tichel, her headscarf, and in another branch of the family, her apron. And these are known as gebenchte Sachen and skulas, as blessed objects and objects of power, especially for fertility. And the power of Eydl through these objects is still with us. There are stories to this day of, childless families having children through this power, but Moshe Yosef did not want me to share details because privacy. So in these stories, we see Eydl as very powerful to this day. Again, the closeness of her connection with her father, and that she was treated apart from other women, right? Whatever, their concepts of gender were, she wasn't in the same category as her sisters or other women. On the other hand, she wasn't simply in the category of man either, otherwise she would have been in Rebbe Chaim of Tzanz's sukkah rather than in her own sukkah next to it, right? So in the inheritance, she's treated like a man. When it comes to the sukkah, she's treated in her own category. So now the final primary source paints a picture very much about these questions of gender. And it's also very different in some ways from these other accounts. And I don't know if I trust it. And a great deal of how we imagine Eydl will depend on how much we trust this source or not. This is from a memoir by an Israeli author, Dov Sadan, who was born in Brody in 1909, made Aliyah in 1925, and published his memoir in 1938 with a whole chapter about Eydl, a lot of which is kind of speculation on his part, but I'll pull out the kernels of actual story in it. Dear Rebbe Shalom had a lot of sons. His son who inherited his leadership, Joshua, was the dearest to him, but his daughter Eydl was dear to his heart even more than his son. There are lighthearted stories told about Rebbe Shalom, that in Eydl's childhood, he would dress her in a yarmulke, because a kippah yarmulke in those days was only worn by males, or that he would jokingly say to it, yarmulke, yarmulke, if only you were worthy, I would be worthy, and my Eydl would be worthy of you, and you would be worthy of her. How he treasured her and held her dear can be seen from the story of the present. Once a man was going from Belz to Brody, and dear Rebbe Shalom said to him, take this package. I've wrapped up a silk shawl a present for my daughter. The man brought the package to Eydl. She untied it, opened the paper, and it was a silk parochet, the curtain for the Torah ark in the synagogue. So the man went back to Belz, and Eydl sent the package back with him. And he went to the Rebbe and said, "Your Holiness made a mistake. You said you were wrapping up a silk shawl, but it was a silk parochet." And the Rebbe laughed and said, "What mistake? Isn't my Eydl a Torah scroll?" Rebbe Shalom would even say, the light of the beginning of creation, this is a concept with all kinds of mystical meanings to it, the light that was stored away from the creation to illuminate the whole world is stored in my daughter, Eydl. If she were male, no holy man would have been as great as she. She would certainly have brought the redemption near, right? She would have hastened the coming of the Messiah. But it is one of the deeds of Satan, the accuser, that she was not born male. So this, of course, is where I got my title for this talk. In truth, her father was pained by this for most of his life, even as he was dying. When they chased away the daughters from his bed, and I assume granddaughters, so that their wailing would not disturb the moment of his death, he said, "Eydl will stay, because Eydl is not a daughter to me, she is a son to me." And Sadan goes on to say that there were close family connections between his family and the family of the Belzer Rebbes. One of his own ancestors, named Rabbi Yoshi, studied in the Rebbe's house in Belz for 13 years, that the accusing Satan had prevented Eydl from being born male was an article of faith for him. The Hasidim, the followers who gathered around Rebbetzin Eydl's table, were many. They spoke in praise of her teachings, in Hasidic language, her Torah. They spoke in adulation of her responses to Kvittelach. There was much admiration of her wisdom, and even from her nickname, Eydl de Rebbe, Eydl the gendered male Rebbe, you can tell how greatly she was honored. But Sadan goes on to give a tragic account of Eydl's career. He says that she saw herself as the true successor to her father, Rebbe Shalom, that she should have been the next Belzer Rebbe, and that she bitterly criticized her brother, Rebbe Joshua, when he became Rebbe, though he had many more followers. In time, Sadan says, this resentment dominated her life. Eydl denounced the opulence of her brother's court on every possible occasion. 2 words, webene hemder, woven shirts, like luxuriously expensive clothing, recurred in every denunciation and became an obsessive refrain that those around her heard over and over. Then matters took a fearsome turn. Eydl was possessed by a dybbuk. This is where the wandering soul of someone deceased takes over a living person and makes them behave and act and talk in strange ways. Her brother, the Belzer Rebbe, Rebbe Joshua, came to perform an exorcism. Eydl, or the dybbuk in her, cursed her brother in a male voice that sounded to those around her like the voice of her father. Taken aback at first, Rebbe Joshua rallied and called down curses on the dybbuk until Eydl collapsed. Exorcised, she sank into a life of melancholy. which Sadan compares to the darkness that her blind son Elimelech lived in. And at the end of the chapter, he describes the musicians who would play for Eydl after Shabbos every Saturday night. She would sing along with a melody called Hirschenjagd, the stag hunt, identifying, Sadan says, with the hunted deer. Her son, Rebbe Elimelech, the blind Rebbe, would praise their music, but Eydl said nothing. So in this account, the maleness is very much in the forefront. For sure, as Sadan tells it, her beloved father saw Eydl as, what he says is she should have been male. I think it's not much of a stretch to see that he sees her as a male soul born, Meisesotten by the deeds of the Satan in a female body. And the suggestion is there that that is how others see her, at least to some extent, and to how she sees herself. Yoram Bilu, an anthropologist, published an article about basically Sadan's account of Eydl, titled "The Woman Who Wanted to Be Her Father." And essentially in that article, he understands her as a trans man whose possession by the Dybbuk was an attempt at gender confirmation, at becoming her father, speaking in his voice, but instead of being recognized as such, that she now was male and was her father, it was seen by those around her as a malevolent possession and needed to be exorcised. And the exorcism was no doubt traumatic for her. So based on Bilu's article, I've done some writing of my own along those lines, correcting some of the somewhat negative attitudes toward trans people that Bilu expresses, and reading that possibility in a more positive light, while recognizing that it's by no means the only possibility for understanding Eydl, and that again a huge amount depends on whether we see, whether we take seriously Sadan's whole account. There are reasons to take it seriously. He grew up in Brody. He had close family connections with Eydl. There's no particular reason he would be making this stuff up. On the other hand, especially this antagonism with her brother is not in line with other documents and stories. So I'm not sure. Now, I first started working on this along these lines in 2002, and I last did research on it and published about it in 2009. Since then, things have been changing in society, and they've also been developing in my thinking about all these questions. At the time when I first started working on this, I don't know if the term non-binary existed, but I certainly had never heard it. At the time when I first published about Eydl, I knew a trans man who had chosen to be pregnant and bear a child, but that seemed like a pretty new thing. In the meantime, it's become widely accepted, so that my sister-in-law, who is a doula and childbirth educator, is very comfortable with speaking about pregnant people, for example, rather than assuming their genders. So there's been an opening up of gender possibilities, which in a way makes Eydl seem more understandable or more within the expanding categories that we have now. That is, if she did on some level understand herself as male and was seen by others on some level as male, that does not contradict the lighting of the Shabbos candles, or the wearing of the tichel and the apron, or the bearing of children and being a doting grandmother. The other thing that's developing in my thinking is that I've been teaching a course called Religion and Sexuality, looking at sexualities and also genders in many different religions and traditions around the world. And it's striking me more and more clearly that these gender categories and identities are cultural. There are not, it seems to me, labels or categories for gender that are applicable cross-culturally. And I will include cisgender in that. A simple example is that among the indigenous people around where I live in Manitoba, a woman who is past her menopause is welcome to join in the men's circle in ceremony. And this is the case among the Mende people in West Africa, from what I've read, and no doubt other traditions as well. So what does that say then? From our sort of standard gender definitions, a cis woman is a woman through her life, but apparently something happens with the category of gender at menopause in many traditions. So this and many other examples of diverse understandings and possibilities for gender in different societies leads me to think that the next step in research should really be to try to get deeply into how people understood and talked about gender in the 1800s, in Ukraine and Poland, in Yiddish-speaking Hasidic and other traditional Jewish circles. What terms were available to them? What categories did they have? How did they understand these things? Whether or not they had the kind of exact labels that we like to have now, what was their sense of gender diversity? Because I'm pretty sure that there was such a sense, but that is, like, at this point, for future thought and research, I have not yet delved into it. I hope that I or somebody else will do so. So I want to wrap it up there, having introduced you to Eydl, and really invite you, first of all, to think of Eydl and think about her and remember her as a remarkable human being. And also, I invite your insights and thoughts on how, in terms of gender, which so concerns us, we can best think about her, or perhaps him or they, in the most accurate and the most honoring ways.
Well, I'd like to open, you're willing to take questions, right?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Well,
and to hear your thoughts.
I'm going to start. First of all, thank you very much. My question is a little bit larger than Eydl, Eydl himself. I know do you know who Polly Murray is? The first African-American Episcopal priest.
Okay.
They were an extraordinary human being, a lawyer, an activist. And he wrote themselves about sort of issues around gender, but Polly was gone before, as you say, the last 20 years. And the Polly Murray Center has argued quite a lot about what pronouns to use for Polly. And it is a fierce discussion, and not an easily resolved one. And I know, looking back, sort of when we talk about, say, someone like James Baldwin, we don't say, oh, he was a Negro writer. We don't use the term that he himself used, because that term is no longer an acceptable term for us. So we call him Black, which of course he was. And so I think it's a really tough call. Like, what do we use our pronouns that we, do we like as we do with the word black versus Negro, do we say our sensibilities prevail? And we look at Polly Murray or Eydl as non-binary or trans? Or do we say, no, the 19th century gender categories prevail? What do you think?
So fabulous question. Thank you. So, I mean, I certainly would not object myself, if having learned about Eydl, and as you think about her, or perhaps some of the other women who entered into the normatively male role of Rebbe, if you want to refer to her as they or as he, I'm not going to stop you. I personally, in my research, have to build ties with Hasidim today. At least that is part of how I see my work as a researcher, including descendants of Eydl, who are not comfortable with contemporary gender, developments in the queer and queer allied world. And so I'm going to continue, in my work to refer to her as she, not only because that's what our sources do, but that's because, the people who have a much better claim than me to be connected with her, strongly prefer today. In general, I mean, as I said to you at the start, I'm pronoun indifferent personally. The whole importance of pronouns in the English-speaking queer and queer allied world right now kind of bugs me, because there are a lot of languages that do not have gendered pronouns at all, right? That includes the indigenous languages spoken in the part of the world I'm in, that it includes Bengali, and I think some of the other languages of India. The pronouns are not gendered, so the whole thing wouldn't come up, right? So personally, I don't feel like putting a lot of my energy into that, which is why, as I said to you before, I'm fine if you refer to me as she or they or he or whatever. But again, I mean, this stuff is all being worked out, right? This is all, where it's all being worked out, and we're all participating in working it out. And I certainly honor however you choose to work that out regarding Eydl and others like that.
I see we have a couple hands. Noah, did you want to ask something?
Or are you?
Yeah, sure. First of all, Justin, thank you so very, very much for this really wonderful and compassionate and tender presentation. I found it personally very meaningful and very moving. And those questions seem so alive and so relevant to me and the life that I live in the world. So thank you. It's really beautiful.
Thank you. I'm very moved by your comment. I appreciate it very much. And did you want to add any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I wanted to inquire if you have considered the person of the Androgynous.
I mean, go ahead.
Especially as you consider talking with the Hasidic descendants of Eydl, because this is language that they might perhaps be persuaded to understand, that has been conceived of by modern thinkers as a non-binary revisiting of a gender role that's in, Torah. So there we are.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, of course, the Androgynous is of great interest. My sense of the discourse in kind of the frum world, the Orthodox and Haredi, so-called ultra-Orthodox world, including Hasidim today, is that it's not seen as a gender category so much as a sex category, right? The androgynous is defined by their genitals. that does involve somewhat distinct gender roles as set out in the Talmud and in Halakha, but it would not make sense, I think, in most of the frum world to say that somebody identifies as androgynous, or that somebody known to be female-bodied could be androgynous. It is an interesting thing that I'd like to know more about. I did a bit of research into responsa, the rabbi's answers to questions in Jewish law around this, because it's been argued that the androgynous is just a thought experiment, that when the Talmud talks about gender, they needed to come up with this sort of this experimental intellectual possibility, like what if somebody is both physically male and female? But in fact, we see in the responsa that there have been intersex children who were brought to rabbis who have said, yes, this is an androgynous. But the discourse, again, as far as I know, really is on that level of physicality. So although I would love to find terminology that the descendants of, that would help the descendants of Eydl to think about her in broader gender categories, I'm not sure if that one would work. But I appreciate you bringing it up.
One quick thing, you mentioned about how she inherited. And that is how an androgynous would have inherited, according to Mishnah Bikurim.
Okay, that's really interesting. So listen, let me think about this more, and you think about it more. You can get my contact information from Jane. I'd love to be in touch directly about that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Rona, did you have a question?
Well, not so much questions as some comments. Justin, it's great to see you.
Good to see you.
For those who don't know, Justin and I are both AJRniks, and we both share a common name. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, so on the androgynous, just as Justin says, it really is primarily about sex, although the Gemara, particularly in Yevamot, does get into gender roles in terms of responsibilities of the people. The Tumtum particularly is a thought experiment. There is no record of a Tumtum ever having been known, but as Justin points out, we certainly know of people who are androgynous, both the quote unquote true hermaphrodite. In fact, I know a pair of twins here in Vegas who are true hermaphrodites, as well as people born with indeterminate genitalia. And I will point out that a mistake that's commonly made is people assuming that an androgynous is by definition non-binary in gender. And that's incorrect, because that makes the assumption then that your gender is tied to your birth sex, and you couldn't be more incorrect about that. So for instance, I have a friend who is an ecumenical Catholic priest who was born androgynous, coercively assigned female, and then transitioned to being a trans man, which was, he has 46 XY chromosomes and was male all along. And so never should have been assigned female in the first place. So it's a big fiasco, but at least he is still alive and doing well, unlike the twins, one of whom John Money killed by coercively assigning female after the botched circumcision. So yeah, it's a really big mess. Never make the assumption that an androgynous is non-binary. Yeah, so I attended a couple of months ago the Porat Synagogue Initiative discussion on transgender people in Orthodox synagogues. And surprisingly, Dov Linzer, the Rosh Yeshiva at Chovevei Torah, suggested that perhaps they ought to have a trachitza to accommodate non-binary people, because they couldn't really figure out an equitable solution with a two-part mechitza. And, ultimately, I think they're starting to recognize that the system of the mechitza is untenable. And that's something that I wrote about and posted on my blog a few years ago.
Rona, can we sort of move it back to Eydl though? Where are we?
Yeah. Well, it is kind of related though, because recognizing the issue of the genders. But getting back to Eydl, I think this was really fascinating. In the Bible and gender workshops that I gave my first few years of teaching about this stuff, I always mentioned the movie Yentl, because of course I wasn't aware of Eydl and the other female Rebbes. And so, this is art imitating life, and this is amazing because in the future now, when I teach this, I can actually replace Yentl with real life Rebbes who were women, and that just makes it all the more poignant. So I think that's just really invaluable to know this, that there actually were people like this. And obviously the producers of the movie knew of these stories, because Hollywood knows where these stories come from.
Thank you, Rona. I appreciate your thoughts and perspectives very much. I provisionally disagree with you about the tumtum, though, because when I was looking at responsa, I did find a child identified by a rabbi as tumtum. Now, and now, when you read descriptions of tumtum as somehow, skin covering the genitalia so he can't see them at all or something, I mean, that, I have read from seemingly reliable sources is not a known thing, but perhaps the definition in practice has been a bit broader. But these are working categories in halakha. And of course,
I have a friend who's a urologist that I learned Gemara with, and he has suggested just so that, if you are a little looser with the definition that such people do exist.
Yeah, there's actually in Talmud, there is a reference to a real person, not a real person, to a non-literary character who's a tumtum and hagiga of a man who then they do a surgery and then he fathers a bunch of children, and it's a great blessing.
Well, and there's also, the midrash in Yevamot that Avraham and Sarah were tumtumim, which is a very problematic midrash because this takes place after Ishmael is born. And it solves one problem because therefore Sarah is still, is definitely not pregnant with Yitzchak by Avimelech, but it creates another problem because Avraham couldn't be Ishmael's father. So that's a problem with Midrash. It solves one problem, it creates another problem.
Stories go so many ways. Sorry.
Some of those literary references like that, the Midrash are, I wonder if they aren't in a certain way symbolic of, Abraham and Sarah are all potentiality, as a tumtum is about potentiality. And as the tumtum later, so a tumtum actually does have an assigned sex. We just don't know what it is.
Right.
And the anxiety is not about whether they have one or not. It's about us not knowing what it is, and therefore it could be, halakha could be violated unknowingly. But so the idea that Sarah and Abraham, who are the first Jews, are of unknown religion is a literary relationship to that. So that said, I want to go back to Eydl, and also
can I make one more comment really quickly,
sure,
which ties back to the discussion. Jane, you asked the question, you raised the point about how would you read somebody's gender from, 150 years ago? As a Bible scholar, I always point out that we have to read a text in the time in which it was written. And I think that's true whether it's 100 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago. And so, if they didn't recognize genders other than male or female back then, we have to reflect that when we study those times. We can drosh about it all we want, but in terms of historical discussion, we have to hold true to the times.
Thank you for that. So, Dundee, did you have a question you want to ask?
No, it was but very, very interesting discussion. But I've been fascinated because this whole, it seems like, I think I've read something about the whole discussion about sexuality, homosexuality, whatever kind of sexuality didn't really become an issue until the 19th century. People just did what they did. There was no morality attached to it. And so there are all kinds of social and political and religious things tied to it that have nothing to do with morality, it seems. So that history question that you were asking, I think is one that I'm delving into to discover how all this happened.
Well,
And again, that's why I mentioned that kind of the next step for me with Eydl would be to really try to understand more deeply the ways that people talked about and thought about gender in her context, right? Because it may not be as simple as we might assume, but it's probably complicated in different ways from our complications right now.
Right.
And I just want to comment quickly about Yentl, that Isaac Bashevis Singer, the author of the story that the movie was based on, was from a Hasidic family and certainly knew these traditions and about these women and others. And the story is much more of a trans story than the sort of feminist retelling that Barbara Streisand did in that movie. But Bernie, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Justin. This is just fascinating. I come at this from a world outside and in specific medieval Christianity, which is my focus. And I had a question about exorcism, which sounds like such a Christian way to go at things, because oftentimes in Christian history, there are people who stray outside of gender boundaries are exorcised. And I'm just curious to know, you may not want to go here, but is this something that is if not common, has happened in medieval Jewish circumstances as well?
Oh, that's so interesting. I would love to know more about those Christian stories. Please, let's be in touch afterwards to talk about that more. See,
Absolutely.
This is why I think that all books these days should be online, where the author could, make changes from time to time. I want to put in that thing about androgynous inheritance, and now I want to put in this cross-cultural comparison to my chapter in my book on Eydl. By the way, I don't think I mentioned my book. Imagining Holiness is the title. It's a book about Hasidic stories, and within Imagining Holiness, there's a section on Eydl. So I want to know more about these Christian examples. Dybic possession, where a wandering soul of someone deceased possesses someone, very often was male souls possessing women. And so, there's been lots of studies about that from different points of view, but where you would see an exorcism Jewishly, and especially in Hasidic circles, during a certain time period, not so much now, but certainly through a lot of the 1800s, where you would see exorcism would mainly be, I think, driving out a dybic from a person, and very often it would be a male soul that had taken over a woman's body. So there does seem to be some connection there.
Interesting. And Professor Lewis, do you mind if I put in the chat box a link to your book?
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Noach, you had a question, and we're going to have to start to wrap up a little bit.
Oh. Noach, you're muted still.
Okay. Another Isaac Bashevis Singer tale is called Androgynous.
Yes.
And that one is also very interesting from the perspective of gender changes, social gender, because a person who is defined as an androgynous first comes to the town to marry a man, and then is discovered on the wedding night to be androgynous. And then instead of being carted out of town on a rail, the Rebbe of the town adopts the androgynous as his shamus. And the androgynous then changes their attire and their social role to become the shamus. And the town accepts this because the Rebbe has endorsed it. And then later on, when the Rebbe, in addition, he is the androgynous is the Rebbe's housekeeper, at which time they don feminine attire. And the people accept this. And they know who this person is when they go to the market. And then when the Rebbe eventually dies, the androgynous becomes the publisher of his collected works and dresses then as a man and undertakes the business transactions to accomplish that role. It's wonderful and may have some relevance in your discussion.
That's fascinating. I do not know that story. I will have to look it up. I knew that Bashevis Singer is very into these explorations of gender, also of sexuality, but that sounds like a wonderful story. Even though, as Rona said earlier, we should not generalize to think that every androgynous would be as comfortable, taking male and female roles as that one was. But it's fascinating. And again, I mean, Bashevis Singer grew up in this kind of world and would have some sense of what could realistically have happened. So thank you
Also,
for bringing that up.
You're aware of Singer has a sister, or has a sister, Esther Kreitman, who wrote her own version of all of this, which is filled with gender, what do you call it? Transitions, I think might even be the word. It's certainly thinking out of the box in terms of her own gender or their own gendered behaviors. So that's another wonderful source.
I will have to read her or them. Yes.
Her or
Wow.
them. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're coming to a close. This has been just a wonderful exploration. Do you have any last thoughts you want? Oh, Bernie, go ahead.
That was just an inaudible clap.
I see the hand is not raised this way, but yeah, got it. Yeah. So are there any last comments you want to close with?
I just really would like to be in touch with everybody who's commented, especially. So please distribute my email widely. This has been very illuminating. Every time I talk about Eydl, I learn more about, how to imagine this fascinating and powerful person. And so I'm grateful for the chance to talk about Eydl and to introduce you to Eydl and to, open my own understanding further. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank all of you who are here. Our next and last of the year queries series is May 12th. Nancy Otto will be speaking about her partner and their years together, and showing us some film on lesbian relationships and their relationship, and how moving and her devotion was, and how that story unfolded. So I hope you'll join us for that. And Justin, I hope you'll come back next year or the year after and give us more of what you've discovered about 19th century Hasidic gender and how we can understand it.
I
Thank
would
you.
love to. Thank
Oh,
you.
great, good. All right, I'll put you down the calendar. Thank you all. Thank you really all for being here. I'm really happy to see everyone. Take care.
Correct, Justin, and a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos.